All right, hello everyone. Good evening. For those of you walking in, you can go ahead and step in and grab a seat. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here on this beautiful fallish day. My name is Penina Laker. I am an associate professor of communication design at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm also the associate director of the Carver Project, which is organizing this event tonight. This event is one of several signature events that we offer, and tonight you'll get to hear from some very talented people. So the Carver event, for those of you who've not heard of us or don't know of the Carver Project, we are a faculty-founded organization of WashU faculty who are on mission to serve and connect university, church, and society. I think we're all trying to figure out ways that we can bridge the gap between what we do in the classrooms and take that beyond the boundaries of the university by partnering with churches like this beautiful church and different community partners. We have different kinds of events that we do. Some of you may have attended them. We just had a really great event a couple of weeks ago that was hosted at One Family Church that was on engaging politics as followers of Jesus Christ. So sometimes we bring leading scholars on different topics, but also partner with both local and national leaders and just have creative dialogue and think about how we can live out our faith and work towards bridging those gaps. So tonight's event, as I'd mentioned before, is a faculty forum that I think it's probably the second that we've had, and we were trying to see ways that we can have faculty share a little bit more about what they do, oftentimes hosted at a local church. We have several church partners. Like I said, we have about 14 church partners now who've been so gracious. They offer our homes for fellowship and faith, so a lot of us go to these churches, but they also remember us in their giving. They host these events, and we really appreciate those church partners because we couldn't live out the mission of what we stand for if it wasn't for them. So really thankful to the Church of St. Michael and St. George that I've heard so much about from my colleague Abram and Christine Van Engen for having us here tonight. And just for the team, I just want to make sure I shout out Shelley, our managing director, who's worked tirelessly with Father Clem's team. I think Laura, Luisa, a lot of people behind the scenes who are instrumental in putting this together. So just really thankful for that. Tonight's format is pretty simple. We'll have John, and Abram up here. They'll have 5 minutes each to talk a little bit about not only their books that we'll be highlighting today, but also what makes for this really unique fellowship and maybe brotherhood that they have cultivated even much earlier than the Carver Project. But during the Carver Project, they being a little fly on the wall sometimes and seeing them be in relationship with each other has been it's a good model. And I think it would be nice to hear about how by them being part of this mission together, how that also has fostered a lot of their scholarship. And as you probably have seen, if you haven't already, they have pretty extensive bios. It's impressive even at like 8-9 points type half sheet size. You wouldn't get to half of what they've accomplished. So definitely do look them up. I do want to point out a QR code that has a ask a question sort of prompt here. That's how you can send in your questions for all of them that we'll have a chance to ask them once they're done. So they'll have 5 minutes apiece, give a little synopsis of their books, talk about friendship, vocation, disagreeing, all those things. And then they'll get into a self-moderated dialogue. And then I'll come back up here with a few questions, hopefully from the audience, so please do send those questions in. And then right after that, we'll have a book signing and some snacks. We have some Carver cookies that have become a staple for us outside. And yeah, so I think looking at the list of things I need to get through, I think that's about it for us tonight. So thanks again for being here. enjoy this conversation. And now I'd like to invite Father Clem to come up, just pray for us and just kind of kick off this show. And hope the talent is ready.
Good evening. Welcome to the Church of St. Michael and St. George. We are thrilled to be partners with the Carver Project and thrilled to be hosting this event. Just a quick note to say that if any of you are in search of a spiritual home, you are more than welcome to join us on any Sunday morning. We have services at 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. here in this space, and also just on the way in St. George's Chapel at 5 p.m. every Sunday. I also want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to our Advent Lessons and Carols service. That's on December 1st. It's a Sunday evening at 5 p.m. Here in the church. If you've never heard our choir before, you're in for a real treat. So it's our Advent service of Lessons and Carols on December 1st. As we turn things over to our three distinguished guests now, I'll ask God to bless our time together. So let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of friendship. We thank you that through your Son you have called us to be your friends. We ask that you would bless our time this evening together, that you would open our hearts and illumine our minds as we listen to the stories of these three authors and friends. May their words inspire us to love you, to love each other, and to love your creation more deeply. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And I'll turn things over to Abram.
All right. Thanks, Penina. Thanks, Father Clem. Welcome to Church of St. Michael and St. George. So I'm just going to say, we're each going to say about 5 minutes, little spiel. You're going to start, and then we'll chit-chat over there. This is an occasion where we're talking about friendship and vocation and the way that friendship shapes and changes and directs the kinds of work that we do. We all had a book come out this year, and in that book, we all actually talk about friendship in various ways. Even in my book, which is about poetry for the church, there's a chapter on thinking about poetry as friendship. And in there, I quote C.S. Lewis, who has a lot to say about friendship. One of the things he says about friendship is that it often begins by the recognition that somebody else shares something with you that surprises you. So the opening expression of friendship, he says, is often, "What, you too? I thought I was the only one." And thinking about friendship in that way. So the three of us have many agreements, more agreements than we have disagreements. And that, I think it's actually pretty hard to be friends with somebody you mostly disagree with. But so we're mostly aligned. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about how the Carver Project has shaped that friendship and shaped some of the work that we do. And I want to do that by talking about one of the disagreements that we had, which is around the founding of the Carver Project around 7 years ago. So around 7 years ago, the three of us each were running Christian reading groups in our home. I did one for the humanities, there was one for art, and one for law. And Inazu had this idea that we should get together and form a nonprofit around these reading groups and the other Christian faculty that we know and build an organization around it. And my thought at the time was, why? I run a reading group. I don't understand how a nonprofit organization is going to change a reading group in my home. It's not that expensive to run a reading group in my home. I don't need a nonprofit organization for that. He said, no, it's going to do a lot of other things as well. And you have to listen close to this next part, because this will be the only time I ever say this in my life. But I was wrong, and Inazu was right. If that's recorded, he's going to make a clip of that and send it to me every day. It'll be like the ringtone on his phone. So here's the thing about the Carver Project that developed out of that. So we began, George Stulak, bless his heart, a saint of the community, already, because he's just courageous and knocks on doors, had found a bunch of Christian faculty at WashU, and we started with those folks, and we started meeting in homes. As the thing developed, it became public, and when a thing becomes public, it becomes findable. And when a thing becomes findable, people start seeking you out rather than you seeking them out. And now, what started with just a handful of Christian faculty at WashU has over 60 members on the listserv with monthly dinners where we get together, gather, form community, and form friendships. And here's where I want to think about the way that those friendships change and shape people's work. So one of the things that the university is always trying to do, in fact, I just had a lunch meeting yesterday about it, is how to foster interdisciplinary research at WashU. Well, the thing that fosters interdisciplinary work is just knowing other people who are not in your discipline. And that turns out to be quite hard because you're mostly in your discipline. It's why you're in the discipline. But if you share something else with other people and get together for that other reason, then it turns out that you get to know a lot about other disciplines, and actually you run into things that are very interesting, and you find connections, and you build work out of it. So some of the co-taught courses at WashU that they have been seeking out have come directly out of the Carver Project because we just met, knew each other, and wanted to teach a class together. And the university was like, how is it that a business professor and an English professor know each other to teach together? And we said, well, we belong to a Christian group together. And the university said, great, whatever. Let's roll. So this is one way that it actually, friendships change and shape the work that we do. I also want to think about that in relation to the book that I just published this year. So for over a decade, I've taught poetry in churches on Sunday morning. I love to do that kind of work and just think about how to use the training that I have been given and the talents that I've been given to think and speak with the church itself. Well, I've done that for a lot of years. Because of the Carver Project and the organization that it developed, when the pandemic hit, we actually brought those courses online. So I was teaching poetry to ministers and ministry leaders across the country online in the summers through the Carver Project. And because of that, and because of the Christian community that I know exists at WashU, I began to see ways in which not only would I be supported in writing a book for the church, but that there was an actual audience for the church, the book that I would want to write. And so in many ways, the book that I just wrote, which is a book about poetry that is written for the church, based in Scripture, and thinking about the role of poetry in the life of a Christian, is a book that directly owes itself to the Carver Project. It exists because of the Carver Project. And that is one way that friendship changes and shapes and makes possible the kinds of work that we do. That book is not really the right career move for me. It's not exactly like where the career goes next when you're in my line of work, to write a book for the church. And yet it was a book I just wanted to write. And I knew because of the community that I had already encountered that there was not only an audience for that, but people who would encourage me in that work and say, this is valuable, let's do this. I see a place for a book like this. And I just want to end on this one note. We get questions sometimes about the way the Carver Project serves both locally and nationally, and there's different answers, lots of different answers to those kinds of questions. But one way that I want to think about is in relation to Hendrix's book, and Hendrix's beautiful book about the relationship between Tolkien and Lewis, and they really shaped the kinds of work that they were doing by their friendship together. And of course, that work that they published and produced and sent out into the world has had an enormous effect on the world, an enormous amount of readers. And so to ask what is local and what is national about what they were doing doesn't even kind of make sense. And there are ways in which the Carver Project works sort of intangibly just like that. That is to say, the friendships, the relationships that we have shape the work that we produce, and the work grows out and has its effects in the world. So this past week, I've got emails from ministers in California and Kentucky and Florida who've all read a book about poetry that exists because of the Carver Project here in St. Louis. So that's just one way that these kinds of effects have, that they go beyond just the local sense of having a pint together every now and then. So I'll just end on that, then we can chat more in a bit.
I loved what she said. Could you repeat that one? Thanks for being here. It's great to see all of you. My daughter, Lauren, was looking at the family calendar today, and she said, oh, do you have that thing tonight with Mr. Hendrix and Mr. Van Engen? I said, yes. And she said, I feel like it's going to be disappointing stand-up because you're just going to laugh at each other's jokes and no one's going to understand you. And then I thought, that's not a bad metaphor for friendship. I mean, I think I'll take that. She's not here tonight. I want to make sort of 3 points that tie to what we've been talking about and what we will talk about. And the points are that thinking requires writing, writing requires community, and community requires vulnerability. At least for me. I think that might be generalizable, but at least for me. So thinking requires writing. I don't know what I think about a lot of things until I've written it out. I have general views about the world, but when I'm trying to be precise about a legal issue or a theological conviction or anything else, I have to write it, not only for substance, but also for tone and adverbs and all those things. And it's only when I've written it and rewritten it that I finally come to learn what I think. So thinking requires writing. I, at least, can't do this by myself. So all of my writing these days is dependent on community. I work principally with students who are my research assistants. I also have colleagues and friends, and I'll send draft after draft to friends, including these guys, along the way. And that is how I move forward in the writing process. I think if I were sort of left alone, I'm not sure I could write anything else in life, because I'm not sure what I think until I write, and I'm not sure what I'm going to write until I'm doing this with other people. And then finally, the last point, that community requires vulnerability. And this ties to writing for me, because we all know sort of through friendship that you're kind of acquaintances with someone until you really get to know them. And then as you get to know them, through vulnerability, you move from acquaintance to friends. And I think for those of us who write for a living or as part of our living, that is most true in the writing process, when we share those raw and unpolished drafts with one another, and we let people into our lives in the mess and the imperfections of our unfinished thoughts and our unformed opinions. I have been really blessed in life to have had two mentors do this for me, Tim Keller and Stan Hauerwas, who were people both who mentored me, but also I looked up to them tremendously, and I loved their writing. I loved the clarity of their writing. I loved the humility of their writing. And I can name the point with both of them when they moved from mentor to friend, and that is when they sent me bad first drafts. And I realized that the books I'd been reading didn't just appear that way, but there was actually some pretty imprecise and pretty non-crafted language in the first draft, and it let me into a bit of the vulnerabilities of their lives. And as I've been reflecting on this over the years, it seems to me that maybe the two are in some fundamental tension with one another. You can't both see someone from afar with a kind of unvarnished excellence, or that person you just look up to, and really be friends with that person. But when you shift and you lose some of that veneer and lose some of that polish and see the raw side, that's when friendship can happen. And I've seen that with many people in this room, but especially these two guys here. With Abram, we've been part of a writing group for years. Mark Valeri's been part of that group, and others. And I remember one of Abram's drafts where he was just stuck on some obscure Puritan persona who was going to be the anchor of his narrative. And everyone in the writing group who read the draft just said, "This does not work. This does not work." And finally, after he heard it 5 times, I think he at least surrendered it to a minor character. And so the process of going through that in community and in dialogue and learning. And then for me, most directly tied to this latest book, John Hendrix is the illustrator of Learning to Disagree, but he's also a key person in its development. I shared a draft of the manuscript with him and said, tell me what you think about it. And John's not in my field. We do very different things. But he read it, and he had some thoughts, and they weren't sort of like, you need to fix this paragraph or this chapter doesn't work. They were basically, this entire book doesn't work. And this was after I had written the whole thing. And this was several years into the process. And so we sat down. I think this was still sometime during COVID, because we were outside, if I remember. And John had come prepared with notes. And as he later told me, he had sort of a flow chart depending on how I reacted to his comments. And he very sort of carefully but candidly told me what needed to be changed with the book, and he was right. And so I reshaped quite a bit of the book, and I think it works much better today because of John's advice through friendship. But I think that was sort of triggered by the effort of vulnerability to say, here is the draft. I'm proud of this work. This is sort of who I am. And in my case, this book is also about a personal narrative, so that adds an even deeper layer to it all. And yet it needed help, it needed community. through community, writing got better, thinking got better, and I'm grateful for it today. Thank you.
Hello, I'm John. It's good to share this night with you and with you guys. I'm going to finish that C.S. Lewis quote that you started here. In a perfect friendship, this appreciative love, I think, is often so great and so firmly based that each member of the circle feels in his secret heart humbled before the rest. Sometimes he wonders what he is doing there among his betters. And this is a feeling I always have when I'm with you guys. I'm technically a professor at WashU, but I don't know how it happened, guys. I just draw pictures. So yes, Abram framed this portion as how does friendship inform not just your projects, but your sense of vocation. So I want to talk about my recent book a little bit because I think it really frames some of these questions really well. So you probably think you know the story of Lewis and Tolkien. They were members of the Inklings. You probably know that. But you probably don't realize just how close they were for 25 years. They were bros, basically. As close as you could get. They dressed up as polar bears once together, and not to a costume party, just like, that is hilarious to me. But with this book, which is an illustrated form of their friendship and the story of their life, where I use them as sort of avatars to look at larger issues, some of the issues, friendship and community, I kind of had this concept that Lewis and Tolkien sub-created in Tolkien's language, two things together that you've probably seen illustrated a dozen times, Middle-earth and Narnia. We've seen those illustrated over and over again. Well, I had this idea that they sub-created a third fantasy world together that lives as a kind of myth in all of our minds, and that was their own friendship. The Inklings is a kind of fantasy world that you probably all have some kind of access to. Just imagine the sort of fantasy of a dark pub with your friends, it's snowing outside, you are reading poetry together, talking about the big things of the world in an unhurried manner with the closest people in your life. There is such a longing for that in our hearts. And that kind of shared literary life with friends, it's so desirable. But it's also kind of a fantasy in a way. Like, I am literally a professor. Do you know how many times I read poetry with my friends at the pub? I mean, only like 6 times a week. No, it's really hard to get together with your friends and have those moments. So in some ways, I wanted to write a mythological story that allowed you to enter that longing for community and for fellowship that felt just like an illustrated version of Narnia and Middle-earth. And I chair a graduate program in illustration, MFA Illustration and Visual Culture. It's pretty new. We've only been around 5 years. But one of the things I have learned inside that program is that our work always gets better in community. Not sometimes, always. And especially with artists, they have been told that probably someone's going to steal your ideas. Like, there's a weird liturgy that artists are these loners. Maybe their ideas might get worse in community because someone might pollute that sort of authentic voice that you have in your ideas, your writing, and frankly, I think that is just not borne out in practice. In fact, we see it in the life of Tolkien and Lewis. They gave each other sort of these 3 aspects to their fellowship together, which was kind of a shared fandom. They both geeked out over Norse mythology, believe it or not. The first time they met, that is what they talked about. Lewis wrote in his journal, the first time he met Tolkien, Lewis wrote, "I met a smooth, fluent chap today named Tolkien, only needs a slap or so." But after that, you may recognize a pattern in male friendship where there's sort of you kind of want to get them sometimes. But After that, they bonded over this shared love of Norse mythology. Tolkien, of course, had a club that he had started called the Coal Biters, where they read Norse myths in Icelandic together. And at that moment in their friendship, they just both needed one another. And after a few months of sharing this strange club together, Tolkien had an act of vulnerability, as John mentioned. He shared with Lewis his own personal legendarium, a story he had written called the Lay of Lethien. And if you've read the Silmarillion, it's really the heart of the Old Testament mythology of Tolkien. He shared that with Lewis and said, read this, see what you think. Well, Lewis read it, basically in one sitting, and he didn't tell Tolkien he liked it. He didn't tell Tolkien he loved it. He wrote a 14-page commentary on this story and gave it back to Tolkien. So they knew right away that they were in it for the long haul creatively. Now, from that point, they met at Eagle and Child and the Eastgate Hotel and the Lamb and Flag over the course of several years until a moment came when they decided that they were frustrated by the world of literature they were reading for themselves. They were frustrated there was nothing to read that they liked, that was written for them, that was fantastical. So they basically dared one another to write something that was meant for adults, that was well written, and had, as they said, the horns of Elfland, some magic, some fairy, some fantasy. So they flipped a coin. They decided heads, you get time travel, tails, you get space travel. Well, Lewis got space travel and almost instantly wrote the entire space trilogy, frustrating Tolkien to no end. Tolkien got time travel and wrote The Lost Road, which was a story that almost was instantly terrible. It went nowhere. He was an incredible noodler. He never finished anything. He was a perfectionist. He eventually threw the story out. But they each gave each other a gift in their friendship. For Tolkien, what he got was simply encouragement. Lewis was the only person who really wanted to read his stuff. I think there is an alternate universe where if Tolkien had never met Lewis, there would have been a professor from England who died in his 70s. They go into his closet and they find 10,000 pages of this weird, archaic fantasy story. I think that's what Lewis gave him, was the permission and the encouragement to finish his great legendarium. And for Lewis, what he got from Tolkien was just as remarkable. He got, as scholar Alan Jacobs said, a way to read the story the right way. When he met Tolkien, he was sort of a theist, sort of. He had come to believe that maybe there was a God, but he was basically disenchanted with all of religion. And what Tolkien did not convert him. That's not fair, I think, to their friendship. But what he did give him is a way to sort of put a little key in the lock and allowed him to see that maybe his love of mythology, his love of story, was pointing towards a bigger story. And that when Christ came to earth, he was the myth that came true. And that all the myths we had seen before were sort of pointing at that particular myth, waiting for that to come to life. So for me, I think we can take a lot of lessons from Tolkien and Lewis. I think they had shared community, as John was talking about. They gave each other drafts of their work, and this was not a mutual admiration society. They really were honest with each other, and they hurt each other's feelings from time to time. We have several letters from Tolkien apologizing for hurting Lewis's feelings about something he read at reading group the other night. Maybe another thing to take away is that they had beers together at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday every week. They actually didn't do their reading at Eagle and Child. They met twice a week generally. Beers at Eagle and Child at 11 on Tuesday, and then reading at Lewis's quarters in Magdalen College on Thursday. So a couple things about that is maybe you take away regularity, having times and people in your life that you can depend on that are not just coming here and there, but are dependable, that recur, that you look forward to. That kind of community actually goes by a different name. There's community, and then there is fellowship. Now, fellowship probably pings to you something about Tolkien. He loved that concept. Fellowship means not just like we're together, but we have a shared destination. And inside the Christian story, that is why fellowship, to me, gets a capital F. It is different when we have a shared destination. And it's not just, we are enjoying our time together, hey, maybe this can help out my career, but we are walking on the same road. Thank you. Should we talk?
Okay.
Check. Hello?
Yeah. Hendrix said, let's do suit coats and button-downs. And then here they come, the cool kids on the block in jeans and tennis shoes. So
Yeah, sorry.
here we are. You said you had questions. You want to run the show?
Yeah, tell us about the worst moment of your life. No, actually, I was interested in Inazu, since you brought up the founding of Carver Project. Inazu, I'd love to hear from you what your hopes were for Carver when you started. About what was it you were looking for or hoping for inside of what this can do inside of a community?
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question, but I will. No, I'm just kidding. I had a related thought that maybe is even more pertinent, which is that as I was thinking of you guys and also other people in the room who are part of this, it was very important to me as we got this thing off the ground that there was no sort of single founder syndrome upon which the whole thing rested. I've seen that over and over again in the country, in higher ed, in the Christian community, and what struck me immediately about each of us is that none of us needed each other for career success or validation, but we wanted to be with each other, and we would be better together, stronger together, something like that, right? That there's actually something synergistic that happens when you don't depend on one another for reputation, for validation, for performance, and that mattered. And then there was also something that I've sensed about the two of you, but also other faculty members with us, which is that we all love and want to serve the university, but we really don't need the university. It's kind of a take it or leave it thing, and I think that's the more that I'm around higher ed, I think that's actually quite rare, but I think we have a lot of colleagues who find their full sense of identity and self rooted in the work and in the job. And I mean, I think we love our jobs, but if they go away, there'll be other things to do. And these core commitments to faith and to friendship trump the university's trappings in some ways. So I think the two of those combine, the sense that we were able to be on our own and speak to various audiences without each other, embedded in the university but not needing the university, that there was something there that was going to allow us to come together, I think, in a different and distinct way.
Mm-hmm. And who are the people that you look to that modeled this in your early academic life? Or, I mean, you talked about Keller and Howard Wass, but were there other people, mentors you had that really embodied this kind of collaborative vocational fellowship?
I mean, I grew up fortunate in the sense that the church that I grew up in, South Bend Christian Reformed Church, there was all these Notre Dame professors, and including the provost of Notre Dame, Nathan Hatch. And a bunch of them were all historians, like my dad. So I got to know these folks. And so what I saw in them, Nathan Hatch, George Morrison, and all these other people, was a sense of community and fellowship that extended beyond the university, but also fed back into the university. And I really think that what the sweet spot of the Carver Project is the places, which are many, where it furthers the work of the university and the university furthers the work of the church, where you find these things aligned with one another. So in the case of, for example, Hatch and Morrison and those guys as a kind of model, these were all historians who made their own work better in religious history of the Americas, of the United States. But also, so the academic work was better, but also the academic work kind of had a home within a fellowship that was bigger than the academic work. So to your point, it wasn't like their worth depended upon their citation count. They had already a kind of sense of community that could say, we value, we have this value that extends beyond this, but let's do this. This is fun together, and this has meaning together.
Yeah. I think also, too, there's a generosity of spirit with those folks, too. When I first got to New York City, I met this group of artists. I mean, Andrew, you remember this, that I got invited to go to this Bible study in Tribeca, and I just went there on a 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. And Mako Fujimura was leading this study. I had no idea who he was. I was like, this is kind of cool. This person is leading this for us. And incredibly significant painter, and ended up being a real mentor in my own sort of vision of how to think about arts as a generative practice and not just a self-centered practice. And he was extremely generous with his time and just desired to have people in his life.
The other thing that came to mind as you were talking is that I think with friendship and community that's rooted in a confident faith, it doesn't have to be insular or the holy huddle. So one of my key mentors, Stanley Hauerwas, what he just impressed upon me at Duke was that he never met someone who wasn't a potential friend. He would just go around the university and he'd encounter the atheist political theorist and say, do you want to teach a class with me? And he'd go to the English department and do a seminar, and he was so curious and so engaging with the people outside of the church because he knew he had a lot to learn from them and that life would be richer from them. And I see that a lot of our faculty here who are involved in the Carver Project are also, there is no sort of circle the wagons. It's chairing the English department. It's starting a program in Sam Fox. It's having real friendship and community with others outside of our own Christian circles because we're curious and we learn from them and we love being in the university too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is funny just being around people that you care about and admire. They can kind of, like my next project, I'm so sorry, everyone.
John likes to take very difficult, dark topics and write them for children.
Yes, but no, it's his fault. He's been talking to me about Puritans for so long that I've been...
What's not to love about the Puritans?
Well, actually, I'm kind of on your side. I think that I'm doing a book on the Salem witch trials, and
for kids.
For children. And Abram has been incredible. He's like my concierge scholar. He just delivers me these beautiful essays and things I can read. And so I just recommend you if you want to write a book, go find the person who's a much more expert in their field, and then just steal all their ideas, basically.
For kids.
For children, yeah. So you all teach, interact with a lot of young people. Do you see them talking about this as a desire in their lives, or is that something you have to convince them that this is a value to find in their education and their career?
I think community is like a miracle. I mean, seriously, like the world is a broken place. People tend, this is my old Calvinism coming out, but they tend towards a kind of selfishness. Mm-hmm. And where you get real breakthroughs requires vulnerability, requires a giving of the self, requires all this stuff of the self that the self doesn't necessarily want to do.
Yeah.
This is why I think, when I think about the body of Christ as a community, I think of it as a kind of living miracle. Mm-hmm. And especially this became apparent during the pandemic when we missed it and when we couldn't gather. All across spaces, not just the church, right? But all kinds of places where you could no longer gather with people. And I find people just really hungry for that. We have right now in the English department a lot of graduate students who sit on the couches right outside my office in the main part of the office, and that's fine. They do a lot of reading there and talking there. And some of the faculty and I were talking about this. Is this a problem? Is this not a problem? They're always there. No, it's not a problem. But why are they always there? Well, one of the things that strikes me is they just need other people around to talk to, right? Like a lot of them are first years. They don't know anyone yet. They're here because they're meeting people, talking to people. They want community pretty badly. Yeah. And this is a space where they can just sit and people will keep coming and going and they can say hi and have other people know that they exist.
Totally. To me, that's the whole secret sauce of education is the community piece. Like in our studio at IVC, the students always want couches. That's never a good idea. The couches are for sleeping. That's not great. But what I did is Professor Heidi Kolk had one of those sort of fake fireplaces that have like a heater in it. She got one of those, and God bless her, contributed that to the studio, and we created a little hearth in our studio. If you come in, you'll see it. There's chairs around it, a little lamp, and a fireplace that they can turn on. I put a record player there. And every time I see it, my heart catches. There's people sitting around the fake fireplace reading books. And to me, that is some of what people long for, is that space where I can be the best version of myself with others. It is actually not just to go to my studio alone and make my works of genius and then leave. Like, I really think that the community piece is what makes an education and a studio experience so valuable.
There's a statistic that I used in a talk recently from, I think it's from 2022, so it's kind of right in the pandemic or right at the sort of end of the pandemic. Anyway, 17% of Americans in this big survey said that there was no single person that they felt close to.
Yeah.
17%, which is 1 out of 6 Americans. That's a lot of people who can't name someone that they feel close to. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a startling fact that was made a lot worse by the pandemic, and that anything that can be done to build community is just super important.
I think we also want to think about the community to what end, and sometimes community is just for survival or just for mental health, but we have such privileged jobs at WashU, and we're in such a community and around other people who are in such positions of privilege. So the opportunity to build community, not just for the sake of feeling good about ourselves, but to your point, John, about for the sake of taking risks and doing things you might not otherwise do, that could at some point be for the betterment of society or helping other people. And I think you were asking about engaging with younger students today. I think they're taking fewer risks, at least the risks of the right kind, because they're so afraid of failure. And I think we can build community that inspires a kind of proper risk-taking. I've long wanted to teach a class at WashU to the undergrads that's just a class on failure. And week 1 would be brief a legal case, and they would try and fail. And then week 2, you would come in and guest teach, and it'd be draw something, and they would fail, and then interpret a poem, and they would fail. And they would have a failing grade until the end of the year, and then the big reveal would be they can write a reflective essay and salvage the grade. But the point would be, this is not about.
So good.
This is not about.
Not sure this is going to fly.
It's not going to.
Go ahead, keep talking.
But to try to shape an imagination away from an ends-oriented, performance-driven GPA,
right,
and into a learning environment that presumes that authentic risk-taking will come with mistakes and failure, and that's okay, because within a properly trusting community, you can afford to take those risks.
Do you see your students struggling with that in English, taking risks?
Yeah, I mean, so you've had this experience. You did, I mean, you should talk about the experience in which the students at the end talked about, a thing that they were not willing to share at the beginning. But I do find that what community does enable a strong community is a wide variety of differences that can be openly shared. And that's also increasingly rare and difficult. And the spaces in which you would come together and meet people who are not like you. I mean, that's one of the good things about a good church, is that you go to it and there are people not like you, who don't think like you, in the same space with you, worshiping together with you. And you kind of have to deal with the fact that they might not be like you or think like you. And when you share something else fundamental, you can actually have those conversations. So in the Carver Project itself, there's a pretty wide range of churches and faculty and theologies and viewpoints. The fundamental agreement point is the Apostles' Creed. If you can say the Apostles' Creed and you are a member of a local church, you could be a part of the Carver Project. Now that's not a low bar, but it's not the highest bar. And that allows for quite a range of disagreements that we can actually talk about because we share something else. apart from all the disciplinary differences that guide us and so on.
And the dispositional differences are helpful too. I mean, John is like Buddy the Elf, right? Just the eternal optimist, happy way too much. And
I love to ping pong between the ultimate pessimist and the ultimate optimist. It's like, you want the worst case scenario, ask Inazu what might happen next. And then you'll ask this guy, and be like, it's going to be fine.
We're like a full
gonna be
spectrum of human disposition.
So actually, this is set up well because I get to deal with both.
This is true. I mean, but this is what a lawyer is trained to do. I was on a church staff for a few years, and we were having the staff meeting, and the worship director came, and we were talking, do we rent the space to the young adults? And the worship director says, what's the worst thing that could happen? They have a bad time and they don't come back. And I said, Dave, the worst thing that could happen is one of them trips on the stairs, we don't have the proper umbrella insurance, we get sued, and we go bankrupt. So let's start there. This is like...
bring him to your party, right?
This is what I bring. And, but it's helpful to be tempered by John's unwavering optimism.
I had this situation. There was a new PhD kind of thing going on. I don't need to go into the details, but there was a woman's dissertation that I was on the advisor of. It was a new kind of system. I was talking to this guy about it. I was like, it's not like the same as a regular WashU English PhD, but it's fine. She's like 55. She's just doing this for the fun of it. We're going to have this defense. And John's like, this is the end of the English department. Let me tell you why. Step one. It's like, oh, okay.
Maybe actually this is a good transition to what are the dangers of fellowship or disagreements or looking at Tolkien and Lewis, spoiler alert, if you have not read my book or know their story, their fellowship was extremely close for 20, 25 years. And then there was a very dimming of their friendship that eventually came to a full breaking point at the end of their lives. And I think there are some lessons in their story about how we care for one another in these sort of fellowships where we are longing to do work together, but do you have thoughts about how we disagree well?
Do I ever? No, what I was thinking of was, so Abram and I have kids in the same grade, Sam and Grace, and a few weeks ago they were arguing at school over who is better friends with Mr. Hendrix.
Whose dad was better friends with Mr. Hendrix? He was the gold standard, and then whose dad was closer to that guy?
But
that was the argument.
There is friendship is complex, especially friendship in groups, and there's a risk of, why didn't I get invited to that thing? Or why are they sharing that laugh that I'm not a part of, right? Or why are they collaborating on the Salem witch trial? Nobody asked me about the legal piece.
That's true.
What's the worst case scenario for the Salem witch trials?
Unforced error. My next book is about First Amendment for kids.
For kids. Yeah, there are risks, right? Those kinds of risks. And also, part of what I talk about in the book is basically, I talk about being friends with a poem or poetry and how it changes, how you can live with a poem over time and how it changes on you because you change. You don't remain the same person. I'm not the same person I was when I was 20. A poem that I loved when I'm 20, I talk about in the book, I read a lot differently now that I'm a father and I'm 43. Spoiler alert, I'm 43. But I think it's the same with friends, right? Even if your friends remain the same, you are not. But actually, everybody is changing at the same time. And so there are paths that people take. There are things that people do that really hurt, but they still need to do them. And you've got to work through that hurt. And sometimes people are willing to do that, and sometimes they aren't. But the more foundation you lay, I think the more you're willing to work through it. Because you realize what is there to be held on to and what's at stake if you lose it.
Right.
The last chapter of my book is "Can We Be Friends?" ? Asking the question. And one of the points I try to make is that in my life, real friendship includes both the superficial stuff and the really deep stuff. I have plenty of relationships that are all superficial or all deep, but those aren't actual friendships because the superficial ones never get to know the person, and the ones that are only deep or only argumentative or only intellectual are actually not human in the same sense either. So I think it's a good thing that Abram is both an excellent writer and a mediocre board game player, so that we can share these disparate experiences in our friendship, and it makes it I think more authentic.
My kids always, we have a board game night with 5 people. And whenever I come home, there's only one question from my kids. Did you beat Inazu? There's other people there. It doesn't matter.
Well, one of the things that happened inside of, it's a good lesson actually, inside of Tolkien and Lewis's friendship, there was professional jealousy inside of their friendship a little bit, but it wasn't the real thing that put the strain on their relationship. I mean, you may not know, Tolkien hated Narnia, right? That almost, you can't believe that that's true. But I just want to remind you, Tolkien hated everything. Like, it's not like he loved all of this stuff and then just happened to hate Narnia. He included Narnia in the things he hated. But that was a real difficult thing for Lewis to hear from a friend after all the encouragement that Lewis had given Tolkien over the years. But believe it or not, that was not the hinge for them. It was they stopped being honest with one another. They were British men who did not talk about their feelings, right? But you can feel in their letters there are things being unsaid, and there are things being avoided. And the pile of those things eventually got so big that Tolkien found out that Lewis was married from someone else, right? He did not even hear it from his friend. And so there are moments, I think, and lessons you can take where there's an easy path in friendship, you know, and then there's the harder one, and it's like, I'll do the harder one later. And of course, any friendship over the course of 20 or 25 years like theirs was gonna have moments where they needed to probably take the harder path together.
You know, one of the things to think about, when you think about friendships you want to hang on to, I see Wally out there, so I just want to mention a praying practice that Wally has, because I think it's really good, and I never quite remember it, so I'll botch it. But one of the things that Wally does is he has different days of the week that he prays for different groups. So there's Thursdays he prays, I don't know, I'm making this up, but Thursdays he prays for his family members. And another day he prays for his workplace. But there's a day in there where he prays for his friends. And so thinking about the day of the week devoted to praying for a variety of your friends allows you that space. I mean, even if you weren't Christian, if you had a day that you thought about all of your friends and all of their needs, it would have a pretty dramatic effect on those relationships.
Well, before we take a few questions, if there are any, I can't imagine there will be any. Are there some? Maybe. Oh, really? Do you all have any books or resources you would recommend for reading about either vocation
Mythmakers.
or... Of course, learning to disagree. I don't know. Does anything come to mind that you would say, oh, you got to read this?
About vocation?
And fellowship or community. I mean, if you want to read a book about the Inklings besides the Mythmakers, don't. I mean, why would you do that? But an incredible book just on the Inklings by Carol Zalesky called The Inklings, which follows the 4 main members of the Inklings and does a beautiful job of interweaving how their relationships were important to each other. And then another text for that is a book called Bandersnatch that actually went back through primary sources and found places where Tolkien and Lewis really influenced each other in terms of almost like line edits in their work, and has some really great ideas about how you generate your own community.
I've been deeply influenced over the years by the Catholic writer Henry Nouwen, and Nouwen was in the academy, was very prominent and successful, left the academy to go live in community, and was also deeply lonely and deeply misunderstood at times. And so I think the honesty and the rawness with which he writes about both the intensity of the community and the isolation of loneliness at the same time, and never sort of fully out of reach in either direction, has been helpful and reflective of some of what I sometimes feel as well.
I mean, one of the classic works, which I haven't read in a while, so I don't actually remember that well, is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer on Life Together.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think there are some great resources out there about thinking about friendship. I mean, in the work that I do, in the period that I study, and especially before, so I study the 17th century, and then if you go back, especially before that, one of the interesting things when you think about friendship is that it was, for many people, as deep or deeper than marriage. Marriage was often of convenience, and friendship was considered the primary relationship, chosen relationship of affection. And that had to do a lot with the way society was built at the time. But there's so many interesting then conversations around friendship in that period because it was such an elevated relationship in the general society.
I mean, only one of us has written a book on Bonhoeffer up here, but I do think Bonhoeffer's he had two dissertations, and his first dissertation, Sanctorum Communio, was about a sociology of the church, and in some ways, the rest of his work is misunderstood if you don't anchor it in the deep lived experience of being the community of the church, which then leads to life together and other insights that he has. And I think we talk a lot about the community of the church, and it's very hard to put into practice in the day-to-day, but that was everything for Bonhoeffer in the lived experience.
Well, and what no one reads of Bonhoeffer is, people read Life Together and Cost of Discipleship, but the letters and papers from prison are him stripped of his community, and it is such a raw insight into his heart, into his doubts and his fears, his longing for the church, and it's really beautiful. So I always recommend people read that.
Karina?
All right, we'll start with a general one. So lots of great themes about friendship, humility, being vulnerable. Could you, maybe more practically, we talk about our work getting better in community, right? So how can someone go about finding community with the hope of bettering their work?
Yeah, I know, this is always the trick. Like, everyone wants a reading group or a writing group, but until you've been in a bad one, you realize, like, oh, no, what you want is a good writing group, right? So I think, again, a lesson we can take from Lewis and Tolkien is start with fandom. I mean, like, my book is basically fan art for Tolkien and Lewis. Their friendship began centered around just fandom of Norse mythology. So, find the people that love the things that you love, even if it's a very specific genre. Probably the more specific, the better, can be a way to then, reach out and say, I'm aspiring to do things that are like this, or that are in this vein that you and I both love. That gives us a shared base to talk about it and a common point of reference. I mean, that's much better than probably just going on a Facebook message board and saying, will you read my kid-lit fantasy novel?
So I just had this conversation with a junior faculty member in the English department because I think she needs a writing group. And we were talking about how to form one, find one, get one going. And she said, well, how did you get yours? So one of the communities I have is a writing group that I've been in for 18 years now, something like that. And the way that we formed is we were all, at the time, graduate students. And we met and we just enjoyed each other's company at the conferences. We were early Americanists, and we were all at the same conferences, and we just met and enjoyed each other's company. Started a writing group doing very different work. They don't do the Puritans at all. But they were good readers, and they were good commentators on the stuff. And we've been together, meet every month for the last 18 or so years online. So I said, you should just meet people at conferences that you enjoy and then see if they want to. And she said, all of my conferences have moved online. So I think some of this is like this post-pandemic of like, where do you actually run into people that you can actually form a relationship with, and then, form a relationship that actually affects your work. I mean, if the end is, I want you to better my work, it's probably not going to work. If the end is, I like to be with you, and here's some work, would you mind reading it? That's usually going to work much better.
I've got two thoughts. First, do the simple risks. So what I mean by this is when I was a college student at church, I remember looking around at the adults with kids and families and thinking, why don't they come talk to me? I'm the lonely college kid, and they've got the families, and they should invite me over to lunch. And now that I'm like the old person with the family, I look at the college students in my church and think, they're so cool. Why don't they come talk to me? Because I'm out of place here. And so I think we're often like not even taking the simple risk of saying, let's go to lunch. Now, let's go to lunch is far different than let's be in a writing group. And so the second piece of advice is when you make the deeper asks, it's okay and probably likely that you are going to experience some no's, and it might not be about you. If you ask me to be in your writing group, the answer is no, okay? And that's not about you. It's just because a lot of life these days is no's, and it has to be. And I think when I was younger, I took every no very personally, like it was a rejection of my soul or my creative potential or my
Right.
ability. And actually, it's just a lot of people with constraints in life. So you might have to try a few times before you find it.
And there's not just like, I got to find my group and then that's it. Like you can have, like you said, there's lots of different groups. Like I don't send these bozos my drawings, right? Like what are they going to tell me about the drawings? No, like I have people, maybe I'll send a drawing to, hey, like, you know, what do you think of this? And then other people that like I want to test my ideas on. And so you need different kinds of people.
I did give you
There's so
some
many
feedback on
quotable
mine.
moments tonight. Most of them are against me.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, I just want to piggyback on that. So when it comes to, like, maybe not sharing drawings because that's not going to happen, but when it comes to first drafts in your writing process, how do you distinguish between a bad first draft that needs improvement, so there's promise, versus a bad draft that just isn't worth pursuing further? And how do you relay that in a friendship?
Oh.
Such as this one? Or has that not happened?
Oh, no, I mean, honestly, I could talk about this for hours. I'm trying to moderate how much I'm going to say here. But yes, the thing that usually locks people up in making work is thinking that it needs to be perfectly formed before it comes onto the paper. Okay, there's this conception of ideation that you get a light bulb inside of your head and then you draw or write about that light bulb on the paper, okay? And that is not how it works. I'm here to tell you that you get ideas by making. So the act of making is what generates the idea. So whatever you need to do to take out the roadblocks to get that first draft onto the paper, that is the hardest part, right? You can't steer a car that is not moving, as they say, right? So even if that car is going in the wrong direction, that's all right, because then you can actually get it back onto the right destination. But most people, they just fear making mistakes, and it's natural. There's nothing wrong with you. That's just human nature. And so the more you can train and practice of getting that really bad first draft on the paper, that's huge.
And this goes back to your opening comments, Inazu, about having a strong enough community that you can be vulnerable enough to share work that's not fully formed. But I think there's a step in between, and that's a step often taken, which is not, here's a first draft that has potential, here's what you should do to it, or here's a first draft that doesn't, just ditch it. The step in between, which a lot of people take, and I think is a good one because it allows for the mentally shelving something, is to say, I don't think that's working for you right now. Why don't you take this piece of it, set it aside, maybe someday down the road it'll have potential, or it'll come around, or it'll be its own article, for example. But for now, it's not working in part of the book. So just take that, make it an excerpt that you keep a file of. Maybe you'll come back to it. And 90% of the time, you'll never come back to it. So it's a way of saying, it's not working, but you don't have to ditch it. It's still there. The person that he was talking about at the beginning is a fascinating figure, Brooks Adams. And I have not ditched Brooks Adams. He's in a file. And when the writing group insisted that he not be in my book, I took him out, but he's still there. He might come back.
He's not dead yet.
There's a legendary story from the Inklings where Tolkien is pulling out a giant tome from Two Towers and is about to read it to the reading group. And Hugo Dyson sees the giant tome and says, "Oh God, not more elves." Right? So, yeah, and poor Tolkien, he got his feelings hurt very easily. And so he like puts it back away. He's like, no, we'll do it later, you know. And Lewis has to come out and says, all right, come on, callers, come on, we're doing this, let's read. So again, it's very hard to share your work with people, even trusted colleagues over and over again. It can, yeah.
And maybe the hardest part is when you might just not be very good at what you're trying to do. And I think Christians especially struggle with being truth tellers in community where maybe the answer is, let's direct you to a different course because we don't want to hurt feelings or we want to be affirming, but there might be a time where you've been trying to do the thing and the answer is probably this is not your gifting, and how can we help you without just tearing you down as a person, but how can we help you move in a different direction?
Yeah, and I think a good distinction there is like, if you're making art as something that pays the bills versus making art as art, right? We can distinguish between let's make this art the very best version of itself possible. That is one conversation that's always valuable. There's another conversation of let's think about how does this work interface with the market, or what can sell, or what can be a property, right? And those often get combined together, and many times they need to be kind of separate conversations.
Okay, so a little bit more on friendship. So I think when we talk about friendship, there's friendship that exists within the context of a community, like you all as part of the Carver Project. But oftentimes friendship might require more of you as a friend to a specific other. Could you speak to how your specific friendships with each other may have provoked sacrifice or hardship?
Every day. No, I'm just kidding.
Wow. Hard?
We sometimes carpool together to board game night. And driving home after one of us is lost could be a long drive.
Or one of us has won, even worse, yeah.
Yeah, I think all love that is cruciform or Christ-shaped requires some sort of sacrifice, and that is maybe as small as being really, really excited for your friend who has made a great thing, that has done well, and there's part of you that's like, wow, that would be something I would love, but like submitting to their joy and really celebrating them, and laying down the sort of twinge of professional jealousy or whatever may come from that. I mean, Tolkien could not believe that Screwtape Letters was dedicated to him. He never understood why. I mean, Lewis became like a hero in America from Screwtape Letters and Narnia. And that drove a weird wedge between them, because I think Tolkien couldn't ever fully celebrate that. Even though Lewis submitted Tolkien's name for the 1961 Nobel Prize, and that was sealed for like 60 years. It like just came out that Lewis was the one who submitted his name. So even at the end of their friendship, they were still in each other's court. They just had a hard time expressing it.
There's a verse in Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And I have often felt like the harder part there is the first part. Like it's one thing to weep with those who weep. It's actually harder to rejoice with those who rejoice. And one of the prayers that one of the priests gave me in high school was to pray, to give thanks to God for the gifts of others that are greater than yours.
Yes.
And give thanks to God that person exists to share those gifts with the world. Yeah. And that is a hard prayer to pray. It is also a prayer that friendship requires. I mean, it's one thing to say, of course I celebrate, like, the Mythmakers sold out in like a week. Like, that's awesome. Or of course we're celebrating that, right?
Yeah. Are you?
I am. Okay. I am, yes. But there are moments when you sort of think, yeah, I'm glad that's good. I'm glad you're doing that. That's a good thing you're doing. And I'm glad that God enabled you to do that thing. And there are those moments that call for a kind of humility. What do you have the C.S. Lewis quote about how he needs friends to complete the various facets of?
Oh yeah, this sort of like I'm not going to get it verbatim, but that, like, when you are with your friends draw out a particular part of a friend that you don't have access to. And so when you are in community, you see versions of other people that you cannot access. And there's this sort of gestalt there. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's a beautiful, it's a beautiful way to think about what friendship is.
And I think embedded in that is also a kind of friend-specific empathy that works in certain registers. So there are parts of the higher ed experience that we can relate to with one another that are just different with non-academic friends. And it's helpful to have, when you talk about sort of sacrificing together, when there have been career disappointments, for example, I think you all get that, the depth of that in a way that other friends of mine might not.
One last thing I'd say about it that's in the specific context of the university. the main thing that faculty there's basically two dynamics that go into faculty thinking about everything, one of which is like money and faculty salary and stuff like that, and the other is time. Time is like the greatest of all resources. But of course, any friendship, and this is true of course of anyone, but any friendship requires time. I mean, you need to spend that time with another. And there are times when a friend calls upon you and you think, I don't have the time, and you have a choice to make about how you spend the time that's been given to you. Faculty think about time all the time. How am I going to spend this hour, these days? How am I going to get time off from this to do time for that other thing? And that is relational. What is the time that you spend in relationships? It could be time you spent in work, but you have to make a choice about what you're going to do with your days.
Nice. Okay, so a little bit about risk-taking and failure. What risks have you taken that were fruitful, and where has failure pushed you in a good direction?
It's easy to look at a book or something when it's done and feel like, oh, this was just a perfect idea from the moment that the author had it. And that's rarely, if ever, how it works. It's always just a total mess, like at least for me, from beginning to end. And there are moments where you're not sure that what you are doing is valuable at all, right? Even if you know, like in theory, I have made a book before, or in theory, people respond to this idea when I describe it, you are still left with the reality that you don't know that this is going to work. And again, back to Tolkien and Lewis, they had no idea that what they were writing was going to be successful, right? And it's easy to forget that they didn't know they were writing some of the greatest children's fantasy stories of the 20th century. And so to me, the feeling of failing in a project is almost constant until it's done, basically. The finishing is when it is like, okay, I did it.
I mean, I think a big part of the game of being in the university is stewarding reputation. I mean, at the end of the day, reputation is all that you have. And so I think there's risk-taking with reputation. Doing a book on poetry in the church is taking a risk. And to John's point, you don't really know where that goes. And in some ways, for all of us, the stories are kind of unfinished. I mean, we joke about this all the time, but it's kind of true, right? The winds could shift and your reputation could sink pretty quickly. And you can actually see, I mean, I can chart that out, like there are 5 different ways that could happen with me. And maybe that comes and
Really? You could chart out how it could all go wrong?
Shocker, I know. I've never. But there's no other way to act in the world but to take those risks. I mean, being aware of them can sometimes help and sometimes hinder, but take those risks and then see how it plays out and hold it all loosely and then be surprised when things amaze you.
But this is the thing about friendship, right? Like it allows you to take some of these risks because your worth isn't dependent upon. The failure has a place to go. You've got a community that you could still be with after your project has failed or whatever. There are things that can fail, and I mean, when I say that the Carver Project helped me write that book, it was in part because I was thinking, if this book totally is a bust, which it could be, is a total failure, a waste of my time, not on the right career trajectory, not the right next book, and has no audience and no outlet. Well, I kind of know that the Carver Project likes it.
Oh, no, totally.
They got my back, so I was kind of like, well, it's okay.
No, this is a good connection to that. I was asked to give a talk for my chair installation. That's just an academic, wedding thing you go through. It's very weird. But you're supposed to give a talk about your work and talk to the deepest parts of yourself in your work and communicate why it matters to the university. And I have all these books that have literally Jesus in it, right? So, I mean, to me, there was some anxiety about presenting that in an academic environment. And to be honest, having my friends from the Carver Project there just gave me a sense of, like you said, they're gonna like this. So I'm okay. I'll just do this for y'all, and let's just see where the chips fall.
I still remember after you gave that talk, and we were all like, oh wow, was like, Jesus, Jesus.
Well, it would be wrong to not include it. That's all in
Right,
my book.
right.
It would be obvious if I was like doing a sort of polite
Right.
dodge around it or something.
Yeah. I feel like you just like said out loud the thing that you've been saying in your books, but like said it out loud, like to the university, which was really, but also I feel like then you gave a lot of us the courage to find ways to do that, because then in Abram's installation talk, there was acknowledgement of faith. When I was putting together my 10-year packet, I acknowledged being part of this community, and I was, proud of being a Christian too, so it's good. All right, so we're going to sort of be wrapping up. There's a larger question. Since we're talking about the university, maybe we can talk about this one here. How do each of you respond to the sort of more recently, there's a lot of opposition to this concept of work as vocation, especially with our colleagues who may not have a faith-based foundation in thinking about their work as a calling. So how do you respond to that opposition?
So one, I have another group of friends that I get together with every year since grad school, and they're mostly not Christians, and but 5 of the 6 of us are all professors now, and there's a sense when you're a professor that you're doing the thing that you care about, even if it's like for a very small audience or whatever. And then one of the 6 was like a mid-level corporate manager at like Farmers Life Insurance or whatever. And so he would always kind of laugh at us when we talked about our work. He's like, I don't find my work meaningful. I work in order to golf. Like, I go in, I go out, and I golf. And especially when I would talk about things like vocation, he's like, yeah, we don't talk about vocation. Like, we just work. I do think in that context, there are definitely ways to think about vocation, ways that I'm probably not prepared to talk, not the right person to talk about. In terms of my own work, I think about vocation in 2 ways. I'll be really brief about this. I do a whole spiel about this elsewhere, but from Luther and Calvin, this is really boiled down. You can think about vocation 2 ways. One is to start with, what are my gifts? And then where should I go with them? So that's one way of thinking about vocation. And the other way of thinking about vocation is, here I am. I've been put in this place. What does this place require of me? Therefore, that's my vocation, to respond to that need. And so one is like, take a look at yourself and go, and the other is take a look at your environment and respond. And I think both of those have really interesting ways of framing vocation, and both are really useful in different contexts. So I'll just say that.
Well, and to your point, one of the dangers of being an academic and doing things we love is that it very easily becomes an idol. It just is very easy to substitute it as like an ultimate reason for what we're doing. And in some ways, there's a real danger in over-romanticizing that. And you do have to have a healthy balance, I think.
I've been thinking increasingly that when it comes to something like status or worth, that in a human sense, all status is local. So you can have a kind of sense of self around what you do, but really most of the world doesn't know or care. And it's probably helpful to remember that, so that you can be vocationally very good at what you do. And especially when I'm teaching and training future lawyers, it's a profession, and I want them to do it well. They're going to be lives on the line, and you can go to jail if you screw it up, so it matters. But at the same time, the titles that we have and the influence that we have is so localized, and you walk 50 feet away and nobody cares or knows, and that's probably worth remembering pretty regularly.
Yes, so unfortunately we're out of time, so if we didn't get to your question, please do find any one of these gentlemen and ask your question, just for my own humor. I'm curious, is there like a contract you all had to sign in terms of how to exit this friendship? Should it come to that?
Yes, yeah. We do have an annulment agreement.
Let's go ahead and thank our panelists today. All right, so just a reminder, we have Carver cookies out there, some light refreshments. I don't want to promise what's not there. There's cookies. And then book signing, so please grab a book. And yeah, thanks for being here today.